Ahora sí escucho, ahora sí escucho. Sí, escucho bien, ahora sí.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Jan Beagle, Director General of the International Development Law Organization, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on feminist climate action and the rule of law. I'm grateful for the support of our partners, the permanent missions of Italy, the Maldives, and the Philippines, as well as IFAD, the American Bar Association, and the Rights and Resources Initiative, in helping to make this event possible. CSW's focus this year on the nexus between gender and climate underlines both the unequally gendered impact of climate change and the critical role women and girls have to play in the fight against it. Gender-based violence, limited economic rights, unmet healthcare needs, and unpaid care and domestic work are often women's realities in climate crises. Lack of clear and formally recognized rights to land put women's livelihoods and food security at risk. Since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, largely as a result of advocacy by women leaders, many intergovernmental processes, including the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and the Paris Agreement, have recognized gender equality as a key enabler of climate action. Yet, despite their strong contributions, women, especially Indigenous women and those from the Global South, continue to be underrepresented in most climate-related decision-making processes. And while significant resources have been mobilized for climate finance initiatives, only 3% of development assistance specifically aims to advance gender equality. Urgent action is needed to address these trends. As the only global intergovernmental organization dedicated to promoting peace and sustainable development through the rule of law, IDLO believes that justice for women and girls is key to transformative climate action. Our policy brief on climate justice, launched at COP26, called on states to champion feminist climate action. Building on its insights, I'm pleased to launch today a follow-up report which looks specifically at climate justice for women and girls. It makes the case for an explicitly feminist approach to combat inequalities, empower women at every level, and put them front and center in the fight against climate change. Our approach has three main elements. It works from the bottom up to empower women and girls to realize their environmental rights and actively participate in climate action. It also engages from the top down to strengthen legal and regulatory frameworks, eliminate discrimination on paper and in practice, and build institutional capacity to ensure greater responsiveness to the needs of women and girls. And finally, it looks at enhancing women's rights to land and other natural resources, including through engaging with customary and informal systems that often control access to land. We are turning these approaches into action through our programs, research, and advocacy in all regions of the world. At the Generation Equality Forum in Paris in July last year, IDLO made several commitments under the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. For example, we've launched a new initiative in the Philippines and Burkina Faso that seeks to build the capacity of women to promote and protect their environmental rights and actively participate in decision-making. And in Rwanda, we are supporting greater participation of women as land use mediators as part of the government's legal reforms to promote sustainable land tenure. Gender equality is a core climate issue, and climate justice must be a priority for all feminists. At IDLO, we remain committed to working towards a future where women and girls can claim their environmental rights, participate actively in all climate decision-making, and contribute equally to achieving peace and sustainable development. It is a pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel, who will be introduced in a moment. Before starting the panel discussion, we will set the stage with some opening remarks. And we are honored to hear first from the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Abdullah Shahid. He has spearheaded action on climate justice and is using his office to convey to the world the multifaceted impact of climate change, including in island nations like his own country, the Maldives.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I'm delighted to join you in today's session on feminist climate action and the rule of law, convened by the International Development Law Organization. Today's theme brings renewed focus on this fact, that women's equal participation in climate action is a game changer. Without a doubt, women are taking climate action at all levels. The stark reality, however, is that their voice, agency, and participation are under-supported, under-resourced, undervalued, and under-recognized. It is time to change this narrative. The rule of law is an important tool to advance both gender equality and effective climate action, and for achieving Sustainable Development Goal 13 on climate action and Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. A rule of law approach to climate action can therefore effectively help accelerate transformative, sustainable, and low-carbon development. Fair, effective, and equitable legal frameworks can pave the way to resilience and adaptation to climate change. The rule of law can also empower communities to take the lead in climate action. It helps ensure that champions for climate action have a voice in setting climate and biodiversity-related policies that help reduce inequalities and eliminate climate-related drivers of conflict. Dear friends, harnessing the transformative potential of the rule of law to address the effects of climate change on women and girls will require, number one, strengthening regulatory frameworks and institutional capacity for the development of gender-responsive climate laws and climate resilient development. 2. Championing feminist climate action and integrated gender transformative approaches. 3. Empowering women and girls to realize their environmental rights. And 4. Improving access of women to land and other natural resources through legislation. 5th, ensuring the participation of women at the subnational, national, regional, and international levels in data collection, analysis, monitoring, and dissemination of findings across all areas relevant to climate change and gender equality. 6th, engaging with customary, informal, and indigenous justice systems to protect biodiversity and promote sustainable use of natural resources, and mobilizing global multi-stakeholder coalitions to accelerate climate action. Ladies and gentlemen, be assured that during my remaining term under a presidency of hope, I will continue to support your endeavors to achieve gender equality, implement climate action initiatives, and your commitments to always uphold the
Olamaydı
rule of law.
İstanbul'da nasıl olmalı?
The leadership of women on the front lines of climate action must be recognized now. I
Güzel.
wish you every success as you negotiate the agreed conclusions in the CSW66. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for those remarks and for your very important leadership on this issue. Our next speaker is Ambassador Stefano Stefanile, Deputy Permanent Representative of Italy to the United Nations. Italy has been a strong advocate for SDGs 16 and 5, and Ambassador Stefanile has played a crucial role in supporting Italy's initiatives to promote these goals. It is my pleasure to invite him to take the floor.
Thank you, Jan. I don't know if you can see me because I cannot activate my video from here, apparently.
Oh, well, we can hear you.
Let me try again. Here I am.
Here you are.
Thank you again, Jan, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity to say a few things at the beginning of this side event, following what we just heard from the President of the General Assembly. First off, let me say that the Italian mission is really pleased to co-sponsor this event. I think this was a very natural thing to do by us, given our long-standing partnership with IDLO, that goes well beyond the objective fact that the IDLO headquarters are located in Rome. I think this partnership is founded on Italy's deep-rooted commitment to promoting the rule of law in both domestic and foreign policies. And over the last years, as you said, this cooperation has produced many results. One of these results has been the launch of a series of conferences on SDG 16, jointly organized in Rome by Italy, IDLO, and UNDESA. And the third edition of this series of conferences is scheduled for next April. So we look forward to continuing this cooperation with IDLO on all possible fronts. Second point I wanted to make, I wish to recall that today's event is organized on the margins of a CSW that is strongly influenced by the tragic impact of the war against Ukraine. The General Assembly spoke with a powerful voice through the adoption of its resolution on the 2nd of March about the need to halt this aggression, and Italy made its position extremely clear on this together with its EU partners. We stand with Ukraine and its people, and we feel particularly close to Ukrainian women and girls for the suffering they are going through. Now, coming to the subject of this event, I think the title of this event ties together three elements, three thematic dimensions, feminism, climate action, and the rule of law, that are all extremely central and crucial for the pursuit of a more peaceful, more just, and more sustainable future. Feminism is about promoting and defending women's rights and women's empowerment on the basis of the equality of the sexes, and it should be clear to everyone that this is an absolute must if we want to create a society which is not only equal, but also more cohesive, more effective, and ultimately more rewarding for all. Climate change is the most existential threat that humanity is facing right now, and effective climate action is today more than ever an absolute imperative. Also, I think in extraordinary times like the ones we are living in after a 2-year-long pandemic and in front of an unfolding war in the heart of Europe, we cannot neglect the commitment to contain climate change within the 1.5 degrees Celsius, because postponing climate action is something we cannot afford anymore. And women can play, as the PGA said, an extremely important role in promoting and managing the profound cultural, social, and economic transformations that are needed to tackle and overcome the climate challenge. Finally, the rule of law, an expression by which we refer to the entire set of tools, norms, mechanisms, processes, institutions, also practices that support the equality of all citizens before the law, secure a non-arbitrary form of government, and more generally prevent the arbitrary use of power. Now, it is self-evident that this is a foundation of the peaceful coexistence among human beings. And if we take this concept and we transpose it and apply it to the international relations dimension, it is equally evident that a rules-based multilateral system is the only instrument that can ensure equality among states, thus preventing the arbitrary use of force and ensure peace. And once again, women can play a fundamental role in the constant quest for an effective rule of law. Their meaningful participation and leadership in decision-making processes at all levels would naturally lead to more inclusive and responsive policies and would help to achieve a more just society. So these are just a few thoughts, just to say that this is why I think the subject of this event is not only in line with the main theme of the CSW, but it is also consistent with the reality we all live in and with some of the major challenges we are called to face. So once again, thank you very much to IDLO. Thank you to the other co-sponsors, to the panelists, and to all those who will follow this discussion. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Stefanile, for those remarks and for the very important linkages that you have made. I'm sure that these will be taken up by the panel, and thank you also for Italy's leadership in this area. Our final speaker is Dr. Fermin Adriano, Undersecretary for Policy, Planning and Research in the Department of Agriculture of the Philippines. Addressing the impact of climate change and disaster risks is a key area of focus for the Philippines.
Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It is my distinct privilege to give a special remark in this sideline event of the 66th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. We are one in highlighting and celebrating the excellence and contribution of women in many development agenda, including climate justice. Climate justice is recognizing that the adverse impact of a warming climate should be felt equitably among the people. Achieving climate justice is a crucial goal for the Philippines, and we incessantly urge the same for our Western counterparts. It is unfortunate that our country's relatively low carbon emission does not commensurate to being exempted from the worsening impacts of climate change. In our agriculture and fishery sector alone, climate-related factors crippled the food system with $10.6 billion accounted production losses from 2010 to 2020, despite its being carbon negative. There is also an imminent threat to our irrigation system with a projected water supply of 0 cubic meter per second by May to July this year due to less rainfall in spite of the La Niña advisory and our archipelagic nature as a country. This exhibits climate injustice that is imperative to be resolved not just by our country, but more so by the highly developed states with immense carbon emissions, which unquestionably aggravates climate change. Empirical evidence indicates that the key agricultural groups in our country are differently affected by climate change. But among those highly endangered are women and girls. Gender gap is still reflected in the recent Philippine Statistics Authority report, which concludes with the need to prioritize the women's sector, especially those originating from the rural communities. Women farmers continue to be discriminated on grounds such as unpaid agricultural work, despite them constituting a quarter of all our farm workers. Stark wage disparity exists with women farmers earning lower than 21% compared to men's salary. Complex social issues are still proliferating and subject women farmers to high pressure. They suffer from multiple burdens. In fact, contrary to popular notions, Filipino women farmers do not have limited participation in agricultural work, but rather are overworked. They simultaneously need to be productive in housework while being urged to share the family's income, making their days longer, rest shorter, and stress higher. The Department of Agriculture of the Philippines puts the equal footing of man and women, farmers and fisherfolks as an imperative agenda under our new thinking and the robust 1DA reform agenda undertaken through a whole-of-nation and whole-of-society approach. It is employed with the assurance that women and girls are given enabling environment so that they can showcase their unique competencies, actively participate in decision-making processes, complement existing social roles, and realize their rights. All of these are intended to initiate a transformational change that will result in a more climate-resilient, inclusive, competitive, and environmentally sustainable agricultural sector. A special program for an innovative scheme in scaling out and sustaining climate action while pursuing gender and social transformation is incentivized through the department's Adaptation and Mitigation in Agriculture, or what we call the AMIA program. This year, we have established 130 climate resilient communities called AMIA villages. The Philippine government provides production support services, digital tools, and crop insurance to encourage women farmers to do sustainable practices. We are also developing a robust information system to aid them to create informed decision-making with their household counterparts. Our learning since the program inception fuel us to fortify its implementation to better match our integrated climate response with the identified gender-specific needs. Among those activities in the pipeline, particularly for women, are providing support to offload care and farm work, addressing their micronutrient deficiency, and capacitating them to adopt effective climate-resilient agricultural technology and practices.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adriano, for bringing the country realities into our discussion. And before passing the floor to our moderator, Ilaria Botelero, IDLO's Director of Research and Learning, I want to leave you with the key message that I took away from the inspiring statement of the Executive Director of UN Women in opening the Commission. She said the interlocking crises we face today continue to compound each other's impacts as threat multipliers. But women are the solution multipliers. I'm sure that we all agree with Seema. If we truly wish to advance global efforts to tackle climate change, we must empower women to lead the fight for climate justice and place their needs at the center of climate solutions. Thank you all for being with us today, and over to you, Ilaria.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Director General Jan Beagle. It's a great pleasure to moderate today's discussion on feminist climate action and the rule of law. Before we start, very briefly, a couple of housekeeping points. Just mentioning that our session today is being recorded and broadcasted on UN Web TV, and that the chat is open. We look forward to an active and engaging discussion. both in the chat and during our Q&A time at the end of the panel presentation. So feel free to start sending your questions using the Q&A function. Today, with the help of our panelists, we will look at some of the persisting challenges exacerbating women's disproportionate vulnerability to climate change. We would look at gender-based discrimination in law and practice, at gender-based violence, at patriarchal institutions. But we will also look at women's agency and empowerment and how gender transformative approaches to climate justice based on the rule of law can be part of the solution to increase climate resilience. In our panel today, we have a wonderful group of distinguished speakers who will help us navigate these difficult issues and provide their perspectives on how we can bring about change. So let me introduce you to our experts today. We have with us Ms. Deborah Enix-Ross, the President-elect of the ABA. We also have Ms. Catherine Megan, the Associate Vice President and General Counsel of IFAD. With us also is Ms. Sara Omi, the President of the Mesoamerican Coordination of Territorial Women Leaders. We have Dr. Claudia Ringler, the Deputy Director of Environment and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. And finally with us is Dr. Omayra Bolanos, the Director of Latin America and Gender Justice Programs at RRI. So let me start with Ms. Deborah Enix-Ross, President-elect of the ABA, the American Bar Association. Good afternoon, Ms. Deborah Enix-Ross. I hope you can hear me, and please, if you can turn on your video, we can also see you.
Hello, can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes, there you are. Very nice to see you. Thank you for joining us today. I have a question for you, Dr. Enix-Ross. Climate justice is deeply related to human rights and the rule of law. Can you share with us your insights on how can the rule of law strengthen climate justice for women? And why should we be concerned with rule of law issues when we're talking about women and climate? The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for that question. And also thank you. Let me start by thanking you for this opportunity to be on this distinguished panel. As President-elect of the American Bar Association, we are also very honored to be one of the sponsors. So thinking about what the ABA, the American Bar Association, has done with respect to the rule of law and climate change and the environment, we start from the premise that women and girls absolutely must be included in the solutions to address climate change and the interconnected environmental crisis of biodiversity loss and pollution. It's as simple as this: no one can be left behind. And so when we start with that premise, what we have found is at the American Bar Association, we have had collaborations on the rule of law and development and led support. It's been supported by our Rule of Law Initiative, by our Center for Human Rights, and our Section for Civil Rights and Social Justice. So as you can see, this is work across the association, bringing in all of the expertise that we have with respect to our participants. And that work has been going on for 3 decades. And in fact, it has been involved in more than 100 countries, involving a range of local stakeholders. And really what we try to do is leverage the pro bono volunteer hours of our members. And so we've had over 5,000 lawyers and judges worldwide who have provided that kind of pro bono expertise. And for us, again, it's really so that our work can help empower women to fully realize their rights, to access environmental justice, and to increase their inclusion in the development, administration, and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. We find that that is the only way that we'll be able to, we provide these platforms so that we can advance social, racial, and economic equity, because you have to include communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income communities, and other climate vulnerable populations. They all have to be stakeholders. And so that is the work of the American Bar Association and how we have come to address the rule of law, human rights, and environmental rights.
Thank you so much, Ms. Enix Ross, and also thank you for mentioning the variety of stakeholders that need to be involved, so that the diversity of women, and also a very particular aspect of the pro bono work that is so important to collectively ensure that regulations, laws, etc., are enforced at especially at the local level. So thank you very much. I am now moving to Ms. Catherine Megan, the Associate Vice President and General Counsel of IFAD. Katie, yes, can you hear me? And let's see if we can also see you. There you are. Thank you very much for being with us today. I have a question for you. IFAD is closely involved in strengthening rural women's capacity to cope with and recover from climate shocks. Can you help us better understand the gendered risks of the climate crisis and its detrimental impact on women and girls? The floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ilaria. And hello to all the distinguished academics, panelists, and persons joining. I think it's really important to be talking about climate justice from a gender lens. In response to your question, I wanted to look at this both from a macro level as well as from a micro level, giving an example of IFAD's work. So, people might say, what exactly is climate justice? And why would you look at it from a gendered level? And I think that, it's exactly as Jan stated at the beginning, it's really looking at climate change from the legal, ethical, and political lens, rather than just from an environmental lens. And how can we have, examples of climate gender injustice? Well, let's look from the macro scale. Take the example of Africa. We saw a release last week of the IPCC climate report, which the UN General sadly referred to as an atlas of human suffering. And I think that it really shows that. On a macro scale, looking at Africa, it's clear that while no place on the planet will be spared the impact of the climate crisis, the places that often contribute the least to the problem will be the hardest hit. And that's what we're seeing about the continent of Africa, that it contributes less than 3% of global carbon emissions, but will experience, sadly, more than 1/2 of climate-related death from illness and heat. And so that's really looking at climate justice from a justice lens. And from a gender lens, a recent report by CARE International notes 3 reasons why women are more vulnerable than men to climate change. I mean, the first is something we saw through COVID. It's that this crisis exacerbates already existing gender inequality, with women needing to do more household work, care for children and the elderly, often being displaced more, with an increased risk of gender-based violence, forced marriage, or trafficking. The second issue is that social and cultural norms often mean that women are less likely to be involved in decisions about how to prevent, mitigate, and indeed cope with climate change. And the third, from IFAD's perspective, is that women do much of the subsistence farming in poor countries and are indeed the primary providers of food, water, and fuel. And these things become more scarce due to climate change, thus adding to the vicious cycle of poverty and vulnerability. We know that 1.7 billion women and girls living in the world's rural areas are far more likely to be affected by climate shock. And so that's why I'd like to turn briefly to the micro example after having looked at the macro example of how climate change disproportionately affects Africa. I want to share with you a story of one of our IFAD clients who's named Aisha from Bangladesh. In her home, regular flooding and rising sea levels are continuously changing the coastline, which you might know is called char land. It's basically river islands formed by sedimentation. Money has been illegally extorted from families such as hers to occupy a plot of land, and the salinity of the water made the land almost inhabitable. So the water was not drinkable, there were no wells, life was extremely challenging. And continued effects of climate change caused more and more flooding, which themselves affected the land. But 8 years ago, IFAD initiated a project with which Aisha and her family joined. And this helped them both gain the legal title to the land, as well as the skill and finance to develop it. It included training in fisheries, crop cultivation, and cattle rearing, as well as access to a microfinance loan. And with this, Aisha's family was able to start investing in their farming and livestock, and knowing that the investment would directly continue to benefit her family because she owned the land. At the same time, a major climate adaptation piece protected the land from further disasters, such as by building raised roads, drainage canals, and forest plantations. I mentioned the legal aspect because that's very important for us today. Surveys were carried out to plot each bit of land, and legal hearings were held to reassign land rights to dwellers who possess no land. And land titles were registered both in the name of the husband and the wife with equal ownership shares. And very importantly, when we're looking at the feminist climate action and the rule of law, on each title, the wife is named first. This means that if she is widowed, divorced, or abandoned under local law, the land belongs entirely to her. Thus, we see in this micro example how land titles are strengthening women's influence in the family and giving them a legal role in many decisions, while also working on climate adaptation. And this is not just a story about one family, of which Aisha is the female lead. So far in this project, 18,000 families have received their land titles, giving them a real incentive to increase land investments. IFAD is further working to scale up innovative projects like this through our ASAP Plus program. ASAP Plus fully mainstreams gender-considered approaches in an effort to address the climate gender nexus. And we announced our commitment to mobilize $500 million by 2024 at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris last year. So with these macro and micro examples of feminist climate action and the rule of law, I just want to end by saying this is a critical factor for the achievement of all international development goals. Advancing gender equality at the local, national, and global levels, including through a real focus on having the decision-making and participation done by women and girls, is fundamental. It's fundamental to truly addressing climate action and to mitigate environment and disaster risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, General Counsel, and thank you for bringing us the examples of IFAD's work at the local level. Very impressive also to hear how many families you're able to reach in terms of land titling and transforming the power of women to sustain families and also to cope with the risks of climate shocks, including the risk of food insecurity, of course. So thank you very much. And I'm now moving to the next speaker, Ms. Sara Omi, who is the president of the Mesoamerican Coordination of Territorial Women Leaders. Sara, can you hear us? We can see you. Very nice to have you here today. Welcome. And I have a question for you. Indigenous women are among the most affected by the climate crisis. Despite possessing invaluable knowledge on how to strengthen resilience, they're among the most underrepresented constituencies in climate discussions. Can you share with us your perspective and experience on these issues? Thank you, Sara, and over to you.
Muy buenos días desde Centroamérica para todas las personas que se encuentran en este importante panel. Desde la coordinadora pues, de mujeres líderes territoriales de Mesoamérica. Es de suma importancia visibilizar nuestro trabajo como protectora y guardiana de los conocimientos tradicionales y que llevamos a cabo una agenda en conjunta desde Panamá hasta México con mujeres indígenas y de comunidades rurales. En este proceso, lo que buscamos en nuestra agenda es justamente cómo tener participación e incidencia en todos los espacios de diálogo, de debate, de negociación y sobre todo para que nuestras voces sean visibilizadas por el aporte que hacemos las mujeres indígenas en todo el proceso, sobre todo de la seguridad de nuestra familia, de la seguridad de nuestra comunidad y de toda la colectividad pues, de nuestros territorios. Las mujeres estamos trabajando en nuestra agenda en el tema del empoderamiento económico, de la seguridad alimentaria, de cómo rescatar esos conocimientos tradicionales. Estamos viviendo pues, la crisis de la pandemia, el COVID-19, y que esto ha azotado fuertemente nuestras comunidades. Y las mujeres nos sentimos solas en estos trabajos, y por eso cuando llamamos a la justicia climática, es como nosotras no debemos cambiar ningún tipo de mecanismo de nuestra forma de vivir, sino que las políticas se deben adaptar a nuestros pensamientos, a nuestro trabajo y nuestro gran aporte. Recientemente en la COP de Glasgow llevamos a cabo de cómo empoderarnos en la agenda de pérdidas y daños, que es un tema que no se mira mucho en nuestra agenda. Si miran la foto que está a mi derecha, que se encuentra una mujer sola, esta foto fue recientemente que pasó los desastres del huracán Eta y Iota, pues las mujeres en la gran mayoría nos sentimos así, sola, preocupada, de cómo resistir, de cómo luchar y enfrentar estos desastres naturales, que a pesar de contribuir con las soluciones de buenas prácticas que tenemos las mujeres y los pueblos indígenas, lastimosamente seguimos siendo las primeras vulneraciones las tenemos nosotras, pues, las mujeres. Y por eso necesitamos, pues, incidir en políticas que contribuyan a las soluciones de nuestros conocimientos tradicionales, a las soluciones de nuestra seguridad alimentaria, y ese es el llamado a la justicia climática que pedimos de cómo incentivar y motivar sobre todo a que no podemos avanzar con nuestros aportes y con nuestros desafíos que enfrentamos con las mujeres, si no tenemos aliados estratégicos como los tomadores de decisiones para poder solucionar la situación climática, donde las mujeres indígenas y de comunidades rurales estemos empoderadas de nuestro sistema de gobernanza a nivel interno de nuestros territorios, y que es importante trabajar en conjunto para poder seguir aportando a la crisis del cambio climático. Y las mujeres y las niñas, los jóvenes y toda la comunidad pues tienen que estar en este proceso. Y sin nuestra participación como mujeres indígenas en los debates y diálogos que se dan en todos los procesos, con las tomas de decisiones, no vamos a alcanzar esa participación o ese desarrollo que aspiramos nosotras las mujeres desde nuestra propia perspectiva. Tiene que haber un cambio y ese cambio tiene que ser tomada en cuenta nuestra participación y nuestras voces. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. Saraomi. It's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for having shared with us your perspectives and helped us understand better the importance of integrating voices of women of indigenous communities in climate discussions. You again mentioned the question of food safety and the importance that women can play in ensuring food safety and reducing the risk of climate shocks. So indigenous communities are extremely valuable, and it is essential to make sure that the governance of climate justice and climate change in general includes the voices of indigenous women. So thank you so much for your contribution. Moving now to Dr. Claudia Ringler of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Dr. Ringler, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very well.
Very good, and we can see you also. So welcome to this panel discussion. It's a pleasure to have you here today. My question for you today would be, one of the fundamental challenges of climate justice is operationalizing strategies and making sure that things work for women and girls at the local level. So can you share with us some of IFPRI's practical experiences on this issue? What can we learn from your work in the field? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction and for the overall opportunity to speak to the topic of gender and climate justice to all of you today. So I'd like to use this opportunity to present two examples of our field work with women and men farmers to understand what really works for climate justice for everyone in the global south. So my first example is from Ethiopia, and it also links to gender, to land titles and access to land rights for women and men farmers. And it's really great to see that this is being done, in many more parts of the world today, compared to, let's say, 1 or 2 decades ago. In this specific example, colleagues at IFPRI try to understand to what extent the strengthening of land rights of women and men increased the adoption of climate adaptation strategies. Interestingly, they found that women's limited knowledge about the land rights reform that added women to the title, added their picture to the title. So it was a very good reform, but the fact that women didn't understand the meaning of the titles, in particular, in many cases, in particular related to tenure security, land transferability, and also rights related to gender equity. Their limited knowledge led directly to their lower adoption of both soil conservation practices and the planting of tree crops and legumes, which add nitrogen to the soil. And specifically, their lack of knowledge about the transferability of a plot that was linked to this land rights reform was actually associated with a specifically lower probability of tree planting. So those women who understood that land rights included transferability were much more likely to plant trees. And registration, if they knew that their plot was registered, they were much more likely to plant leguminous crops, which improve soil fertility. So what that tells us is that just focusing on those technologies and practices such as training on soil conservation practices, tree and legume planting, and to impart knowledge on the adaptation and mitigation potential of these climate resilience strategies is not enough. It will not support women's climate change adaptation because they do not own the land, They cannot take decisions on the land, or even if they could, they are not aware that they can. So land rights registration, in this case on its own, was not sufficient for them to actually undertake climate resilience strategies. So what does that tell us? For both of these interventions, the practices and technologies and the change in the legal land rights system, for these to make a difference, what was needed is a legal literacy campaign, so that women actually understand what the land rights reform entails, and not solely a technology campaign and not solely a registration of rights. So to be transformative, both interventions, both types of interventions need to be brought together to really achieve climate justice. The second example is from an ongoing study on increasing women's climate resilience through videos showing women farmers implementing women farmers' self-identified preferred climate change adaptation practices in Gujarat, India, Kenya, and Uganda. This builds, why are we doing this? It builds on earlier work where we found that women's lack of access to information on specific climate resilience strategies limits directly their adoption of these strategies. Key challenges that we identified included that resilience strategies focused on men farmers, information that men received was not shared in the household, or even if shared, it did not lead to changes in practices of women. If, however, women were directly made aware of climate resilience strategies in their domains, such as managing small livestock or post-harvest practices, that's examples from Bangladesh, they were as likely or even more likely than men to adopt these practices. So we have to overcome this information bottleneck. It is clear from the work we have done that climate adaptation strategies that are not designed by women, do not reflect women's own aspirations and ideas, are unlikely to achieve their full potential. But even videos, of course, have their limitations. Video-based approaches that show men or that show a man and a woman are less likely to lead to changes in farming practices by women farmers. Today's extension services, however, remain largely dominated by men. Most NGOs and government agencies continue to focus on practices and technologies geared towards male household heads. So this bottleneck simply remains. Our collaborators, including Self-Employed Women's Association in India and groups in Kenya, directly focus on women farmers, but also work with men farmers. Similarly, while videos can overcome some of the mobility constraints that women often face in relation to demonstration plots, farmer field days, and the timing of extension visits, substantial gap in mobile phone ownership and internet use remains between women and men farmers, particularly in South Asia, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, just focusing on videos and assuming that women will have access to this type of information or this information channel is also a fallacy. So we have to be very careful. So we need to overcome these knowledge access gaps for truly gender transformative climate resilience strategies. So legal frameworks and transformative approaches here would need to focus on increased gender equity in information provision across all channels, as well as the use of innovative approaches that address women's mobility and time challenges. So yeah, I would like to leave you with those two examples. We are learning more and more what needs to be done for gender climate justice, but obviously there's a very long way to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ringler. This is extremely interesting. So thank you for sharing with us the specific element of technology and information access gap. So a continued focus on technology obviously is not enough if rights are not improved, if access to information is not improved, if women are not empowered to be aware of their rights and to know the tools that will bring them to access important information as well as remedies, and in this case justice systems as well. So very, very important point. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. And before moving to my last speaker, I see that the chat is very active, so thank you very much for continuing to populate our chat, and the Q&A session will start very soon. So please bring your questions up, and we will make sure to share them with our panelists in just a few minutes. But before doing that, our last panelist today is Dr. Omayra Bolanos, the Director of Latin American Gender Justice Programs at Rights and Resources International. Omayra, thank you for being with us today. Here you are. It's a pleasure to see you and to have you on the panel. Climate justice is strictly linked to women's empowerment and leadership. Can you share with us your perspectives on the role of feminist movements in climate mitigation and adaptation? Thank you, Omayra, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody. Whenever you are, it's a pleasure to be here among all these excellent group of panelists. To respond to your question, I wanted to take an angle in terms of climate finance and how that is getting into women's. So today I'm talking about why climate finance must not leave behind indigenous, Afro-descendants, and local community women. So in other words, to break the bias, as this is the hashtag of the celebration of women's, that is how we can break the bias by making funding available to women and girls. And I'm gonna explain why. As in terms of climate change, forests and lands are essential for achieving climate and development ambitions. This is clear for all of us. And evidence across several years has been showing that indigenous and local community women play a vital role in the maintenance of globally significant greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs. However, the absence of tenure security for those communities renders them and their lands and forests exposed to external pressures, hampering their ability to sustainably govern and manage those areas and meet their livelihoods needs. To date, up to 2.5 billion indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and local communities across the globe have historic rights and customarily manage at least 50% of the world's lands, but legally own only just 10% of those lands. And indigenous and local community women comprise more than half of the 2.5 billion people who relied on the community lines to support their livelihoods, food security, energy, traditional medicines, and cultural and religious traditions. Women's play primary responsibility for preserving land and resources of community without the legal securities that their male counterparts have at the global level. So despite these significant contributions, research has found that less than 1% of official development assistance for climate change mitigations and adaptation has been reserved for community forestry over the last decade. And only a tiny fraction of this amount was dedicated to projects advancing collective land and forest tenure rights. But women among all marginalized groups in the world receive less support in financial, technical, and political terms to overcome the constraints they face. Other studies have shown that indigenous women's organizations receive less than 0.7% of all recorded human rights global funding. And we are not talking in here about climate funding. So where resources are reaching indigenous women's organizations, they are typically small scale and short term. And data on access to funding is virtually non-existent for Afro-descendant or other ethnic groups, women groups at the local level. So we consider that climate financial institutions had yet to dedicate the resources required to secure women's human and land tenure rights to ensure that we all achieve the goals to mitigate climate change. The historic 1.7 billion pledge made at the COP26 last year by governments and donors in support of indigenous peoples and local communities is a step in the right direction. But more needs to be done to ensure that climate finance fully reaches communities and women on the ground, those that are protecting and restoring our landscape. Climate finance must be gender inclusive and sensitive, and recognize the contributions that women from indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local communities make towards mitigating climate change. In turn, we also claim that climate finance should try to prevent and mitigate the adverse impacts that climate change and sometimes climate initiatives have on the lives of communities and women. So a group of 40 grassroots women's organizations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and Rights and Resources Initiative, we are making a call to international donors and governments to prioritize funding for women's organizations in the global south, who has historically been excluded from climate change decision process. So some ideas are being held for this and how to get funding for women. First, we should secure women's lands, forests, and water tenure rights by helping to improve or create gender-sensitive policy reforms and regulations, and ensure that these policy regulations are implemented. Contribute to women's empowerment and self-determination by supporting women-led economies, initiatives, and livelihoods enterprises. And how to ensure that funding goes directly to women's organizations, so we are having some recommendations. First, it's important to open new lines of funding to support women's roles as frontline environmental, land, and water right defenders, and guarantee that the funding, as well as grievance redress mechanisms, ensure the long-term protection and capacity building. Prioritize specific allocation funds for indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local community women with flexibility and focus on increasing their capacity to manage funds, and support their initiatives at all levels, and engage with direct dialogue with women to ensure a bottom-up approach that recognizes their leadership, expertise, and visions. As my previous panelist, Sarah Omi, from Panama, the indigenous women say, if women are present in the climate change talks and climate change decision-making, we cannot get to anywhere. Women are important in these decisions. So ensuring women's and community tenure rights and voice in the climate change decisions is a cost-effective pathway to mitigate climate change. So this is the sort of in contributions from the 40 organizations on Rights and Resources Initiative that we want to make in terms of linking climate change finance and women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Omayra, for bringing the perspective of the importance perspective of climate financing and the necessity for funding to be channeled to support the empowerment of women, and also to support projects and initiatives that are led by women. So we're very grateful for this particular perspective, also in the context of women's leadership. So we are now coming to the Q&A part of our conversation today. We received so many questions, and we are trying to select a few questions for our panelists today. And we have a question for Ms. Enix Ross. Deborah, we have a question for you from the Italian youth delegate, Marco, who is telling us, first of all, Deborah, I just wanted to make sure you can hear me. Yes. So Marco is asking, since SDG 16 underlines the importance of creating strong institutions to maintain peace. And since youth is an important time of life to build trust in these institutions, he would like to ask, how can we include young people, and in particular young women, in the decision-making processes, also at the national level, through the implementation of the rule of law? And perhaps you have some examples or something to share with us from the American Bar Association, how we make sure that young women, also young women justice professionals, are more included in these processes and decision-making and governance structures. Thank you,
Yes,
Deborah.
yes. Thank you for that question, which underscores a really important point, which is that the youth must be involved in the decision making and be heard as part of the discussions. And so there are a number of ways that can be done. In the American Bar Association, we have, of course, for law students, we have a law student division, and there already we see the interest in environmental justice issues, but it's that's at the law student level. And so going even before that, we have these kind of pipeline discussions. And I wanted to acknowledge that we have something we're calling Promoting Environmental Justice Youth. It's a specific program that the ABA's section on civil rights and social justice has. And it's an initiative to provide educational videos and then written responses to questions from youth on environmental justice. And you can access that through the Civil Rights Civic Institute. And there they have literally, and the ability now, because of the pandemic, one of the advantages is we can now connect in this way. And so you can send them messages and ask questions, and they will be able to provide you with direction and information that is also can be adapted to your local environment. So again, that is the Civil Rights and Social Justice section of the American Bar Association, and it's called the Civil Rights Civic Institute, and it's specifically designed for youth. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And Katie, we have a question for you from Buluma, who was very impressed on by your land titling example. So Buluma is asking, in those instances where the woman is actually a minor, for example, in the situation of child marriages, how can we make sure that the legal title is passed on to the right person, considering that minors do not necessarily have the legal capacity to own property? So if I encounter perhaps some of these examples, and how do we resolve issues where the person who has been affected by the effects of climate change is actually a minor with limited capacity to act from the legal point of view? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that's an excellent question. I'd reflect back, I guess, taking a step back and answering, to highlight and underscore again what our colleague from IFPRI said, that it's very important to change the laws, and particularly the laws on land titles, but that alone is not enough. What really is needed is transforming the power relationships that are shaped, yes, by the laws, but also by unequal cultural gender norms and practices, such as child marriage, which is referred to in this very good question. So that's part of it, is that it's a larger and bigger type of problem. And what IFA tries to do in our work is, yes, to work to help change the laws, to have those laws known. Of course, the particular specific question here depends on the law of each country and where we work we're 177 member states. We're working in about 100 countries. So you can't use the exact same method in each one. That's why it's very important to have a tailored approach and understand in which countries you're seeing things such as child marriage. Now, that said, we work on land titling and these types of things, but we involve also gender transformative outcomes more broadly. And what does that mean? That means really looking at addressing women's conditions broadly, so their practical needs, improving their access to technical knowledge, to skills, their access to assets such as money and finance, and their strategic interests by working to change unequal gender power dynamics, increase women's decision-making role, and these kind of formal as well as informal structures that reinforce gender inequalities, such as child marriage. So I would say at the same time, it's important, yes, to change the laws, but also to bring about that larger change that will also influence the dynamics of power, which are behind a lot of these laws that are quite discriminatory. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for taking the broader picture and highlighting the importance of acting on several fronts. Laws is just a component of a bigger puzzle that we need to solve. Sarah, there is a question for you from Joe at the Gender Center of the Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies in Geneva. Joe is wondering, based on your experience, what do you see as the barriers, the key barriers, as well as the promising practices for ensuring that local knowledge, especially Indigenous women's local knowledge, is valued and integrated within climate policies and legislation. So if you had to pinpoint 2 or 3 key problems and perhaps a couple of solutions for making sure that Indigenous women are heard and their voices integrated in climate policies and legislations, what would you suggest? Thank you.
Gracias por la pregunta, y cuando hablamos de barreras, en el caso de la participación, pues, o el trabajo de las mujeres indígenas y de comunidades territoriales, pues, primero el hecho de ser mujer es una barrera que tenemos, y segundo, ser mujer indígena y no teniendo el valor primeramente a nivel interno de nuestro territorio. Son las primeras, como decir, barreras que tenemos como mujeres. Pero paralelo a eso, a nivel pues de nuestros territorios, somos las que estamos trabajando por cómo mantener viva nuestra esencia cosmogónica, espiritual, tradicional, y que tenemos esa relación estrecha con nuestros conocimientos y sobre todo con el bosque, porque es allí donde está toda nuestros elementos necesarios, como nuestra medicina, nuestros alimentos, nuestra comida. Y cuando hablamos del enfoque pues, de la participación política de las mujeres, es justamente cómo podemos acceder a tener esa voz visible, de cómo compartir nuestras experiencias o visión que pueda ayudar a mejorar las condiciones o situaciones de las mujeres dentro de nuestros territorios. Existen legislaciones, en el caso pues, de Panamá o Centroamérica, que van de la mano para la protección de los recursos naturales o medio ambiente, pero se ha quedado muy corto en su implementación o aplicación. Existen las normas, pero no hay una aplicación como se debe. Y en el caso de la participación de las mujeres, es muy escasa las voces que se requieren. Y la otra de las barreras que también quiero aprovechar, y lo que se ha mencionado mucho, y a la cual aspiramos como mujeres líderes territoriales de Mesoamérica, es justo reconocimiento de nuestros derechos, el acceso a financiamiento, para que podamos seguir rompiendo esas barreras o brechas de vulneración que existen en nuestro territorio, de cómo mejorar nuestros conocimientos tradicionales, de cómo empoderar a las mujeres económicamente para romper las brechas, en este caso de la violencia a nivel interno de nuestro territorio, de cómo también tener acceso a esa participación plena y efectiva en los procesos de diálogo, tanto a nivel interno de nuestro territorio como a nivel afuera y a nivel pues también regional e internacional de nuestra participación. Y ese es justamente el trabajo que hacemos desde la Coordinadora de Mujeres Líderes Territoriales, de cómo posicionar nuestras voces, de cómo trabajar utilizando nuestros conocimientos tradicionales. Y aquí de vuelta, cuando solicitamos justicia climática, es justamente ese reconocimiento de nuestra participación como mujeres capaces de poder seguir resistiendo ante la lucha pues de los efectos del cambio climático, que no solamente tiene que ver con los efectos del clima, sino que también tiene que ver con los efectos de la misma vivencia dentro de nuestras comunidades, de mejor acceso a educación, de mejor acceso a salud, de mejor conocimiento de todo lo que tiene que ver con nuestros derechos a nivel pues de nuestros territorios.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this comprehensive response. And also you have given us some very practical and concrete entry points for us really to reflect on. So it's really appreciated. We have so many questions. So let me continue with our list. Claudia, there is a question for you. Getane was very much interested in your presentation and was wondering whether once you have identified the gap and the fact that technology is insufficient if rights are not improved, what type of specific gender transformative approaches can be used to improve the situation and to overcome these obstacles? Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah, so I mean, just quickly, the specific proposal for the Ethiopian case, where we do have a land rights reform that was very gender sensitive and responsive, is a legal literacy campaign. So that is definitely something that would need to be implemented if we are serious about various aspects, but including the climate resilience potential of land rights reform. And I saw that the call for action of rights and resources that was put in the chat also specifically includes a call for these kind of campaigns. So to actually increase capacity of rural women and obviously women everywhere to understand what land rights actually entail for them. And then specifically maybe for Ethiopia to add, Ethiopia has one of the most well-known and most effective social protection programs, the public safety net program, productive safety net program, sorry. And there is, again, research from IFPRI, but also others that has shown that members of this program are able to overcome drought events, adverse climate risk events much faster and better. So in terms of retaining their household dietary diversity, food security, etc. But obviously those programs, are resource intensive. So they don't come at zero cost. Donors continually want to disengage and want people to graduate. But reality is, those adverse climate events are growing in frequency and intensity, and this graduation idea is important. But the key actually is to ensure that everyone, in fact, that we more likely than not grow those programs, and especially during also human, other disasters. Obviously, droughts and floods are some, but there are obviously other disasters nowadays. So those existing programs have shown to be particularly effective because they can be cranked up quite fast. The relationships already exist. The identification strategies already exist. So those are actually a very valuable program also for overall disaster risk management. And then we've also done research to show that smallholder farmer households with access to small-scale irrigation have successfully and are successfully overcoming adverse drought risk events in Ethiopia. So that's another strategy. So we have the land rights reform, the training on those rights. We have the productive safety net program. We have small-scale irrigation, which we know it's more challenging to reach women with small-scale irrigation, but it's doable, again, with intentional strategies to do so. All of these initiatives, sorry, the last two initiatives for sure can overcome drought challenges. The first one is important for these longer-term climate resilience investments for women to undertake those as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Very, very interesting. I have a question for Omayra. Daniel is asking, in your experience, Omayra, how has the legal reform of land rights or tenure rights for women strengthen their capacity to participation and also to support sustainable climate action initiatives? In other words, what laws should we push to support feminist climate action, land tenure or others? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Precisely this where we work. I think policy reforms, regulations, and normatives at the legal level that clearly define the rights of women are important, because that helps to bring down changes at the community or the institutional level, or at the international narrative and spaces for participation. But laws by itself don't change anything. So we need, when we are doing policy reforms and normative reforms, they need to be a process of changing institutional capacities and understanding of the changes of the law and how to implement them. So we need changes at the institutional level, national level, institutional, that are in charge of implementing the law. We need changes at the community level in terms of the customary norms or the legal norms that have been practices that have limited the opportunity for women to be a representative, to be a participant of process of decision making, and we need to change that. So we have been developing some strategies at the international level, trying to change narrative, but at the community level, we have been supporting some capacity building in terms of how to change community norms, changing norms that allow women to be participants. Incredible, but there are many norms at the community level that define that the participation is only in the male domain. So we need to start changing those processes to bring the voices at the community level, increase leadership capacities. Women have leadership, but if they don't practice it, it's not possible. Bring women as a representative of communities, so the voices and different perspectives are bringing at the national level. But at the same time, we have been supporting indigenous women's communities, such in cases in Peru, where women's organizations are training governmental officials on how to implement a gender perspective when they are implementing a tenure rights titling project. Now, it's a bit a different dimension. Title for women is not only the name on the title, it's a big step, an important step, but to be empowered, women has to have the capacity to make decisions along with men and other actors in the community about the future, about how to manage a land, how to manage a common land and make decisions and benefit from that. So changes need to be done at different levels and scales for a more integral perspective of what access to land, rights to land, and access to resources and rights over those resources means. It cannot be just one thing. So the actions need to be at different scales, different actors to be able to enjoy the realization of those rights that we want, rights for women, rights for land access and decision-making on that. And that will empower women better.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Omayra. We are receiving more questions, so we have time for perhaps another 1 or 2 questions. Keep on sending your questions and we will try to post them to our panelists. Sarah, there is a lot of interest in Indigenous women's issues. And so I have actually another question for you. It's about the question of free, prior, and informed consent, which is an internationally recognized human rights principle, which gives Indigenous people the final say over all development projects that take place on their land and territory. So our audience would like to know, how can we ensure that women and girls in particular are able to fully provide their consent to projects which affect their land and resources? So if you can help us understand how this consent really is given at the Indigenous level, and how can women be supported in having their voices heard in terms of consenting to any development projects that happens on their land.
Y cuando hablamos del consentimiento libre, previo e informado, reconocido como un derecho humano para los pueblos indígenas, que igualmente se encuentra en muchas legislaciones de nuestros países, pero la aplicabilidad de la misma se tiene que garantizar, y creo que hay un mecanismo o un entendimiento, creo que muy poco real en materia de su aplicación. Cuando se habla del consentimiento, para nosotros no es simplemente dar una autorización por escrita o que llegue alguien y te informe de que vamos a realizar un proyecto que va a impactar nuestra forma de vivencia dentro de nuestro territorio. Y yo soy modelo y ejemplo porque vengo de una generación de mis abuelos que fueron desalojados forzosamente para el desarrollo de todo Panamá, pero que al final no se cumplieron los mecanismos necesarios, y recientemente obtuvimos, por ejemplo, los títulos de propiedad colectiva de tierra, pero después de 40 años, y eso no justifica de que efectivamente se cumpla el consentimiento libre, previo informado. Ahora es primordial que cuando hablamos de ese consentimiento se garantice plena y efectivamente nuestra participación desde el enfoque como pueblos indígenas, pero también desde el enfoque de la participación nuestra como mujeres. No solo vernos que nos vean como un símbolo de que la mujer está, pero no con la fuerza de tomar decisiones. Las mujeres, los jóvenes, las niñas, tenemos que estar también vinculadas a este proceso, porque si va a afectar cualquier tipo de programa a nuestra forma de vida, nosotras también como mujeres tenemos que estar enteradas. ¿Y cuál es el mecanismo que se pide aquí? Es que se respeten las gobernanzas territoriales de cada pueblo, que permita tener también la participación de las mujeres, que se garantice justamente los mecanismos nuestros de cómo aportar a estos procesos de desarrollo, y pues si no tienen nuestro consentimiento, para respetar también este mecanismo y buscar el mejor, como decir, acceso para hacerlo. No solamente de que se pueda justificar que existe consentimiento cuando no lo hay. En su gran mayoría, los pueblos indígenas decimos no a algún tipo de proyecto que va a impactar negativamente a nuestro territorio, pero en su gran mayoría no se cumple. Si hay consentimiento o no, pues en la gran mayoría de los ejemplos se dan los proyectos que impactan a nuestros territorios. Y como mujeres también estamos diciendo, por eso, que las políticas no tienen que venir hacia nuestras comunidades, tienen que salir de nuestras necesidades, nuestras decisiones, de nuestra forma de pensar, desde nuestra misma mirada como mujer, preocupada por las necesidades de nuestras comunidades, pero también buscando alternativas de cómo mejorar nuestras condiciones de vida. Y que los programas de desarrollo o de proyectos que quieran dirigirse a nuestros territorios, que tengan en cuenta nuestra visión, nuestra perspectiva, para poder empujar esa agenda que se necesita y que nuestra voz efectivamente esté allí plasmada.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, for this intervention as well. It's an extremely important point to raise. I'm afraid we have so many questions, and I'm afraid it's difficult at this stage to open the floor again for another round of question and answers. But let me just read some of the questions so that we leave them with the audience and with the panelists for our thinking. For example, there has been quite a lot of interest about best practices to integrate the interest of women, girls, indigenous women, refugee women, disabled women in a disaster risk reduction and management. So there is a whole question of how do we integrate diverse women at national level policies that have to do with disaster risk reduction. There are also questions, specific questions about local communities that are in coastal areas. So what about vulnerabilities of women living in coastal areas? We also have questions, specific questions about populations and specific laws that affect local communities, so regulations instead of legal frameworks of a more general nature. Women with disability, again, has been really at the center of many questions, but I think it is, we won't have time to tackle these issues for today, although these are extremely relevant and important. So I would like to conclude just by, first of all, thanking the panel. It has been an extremely interesting discussion where we have really highlighted the need for women and girls to participate and lead efforts to achieve climate justice as equal rights holders and as agents of change. We also have stressed how the impact of climate change on women and girls is really significant. So an explicitly feminist approach to climate justice based on the rule of law is needed to ensure women's inclusion in decision-making, especially indigenous women, and in climate governance and the resolution of conflicts over natural resources, especially land conflicts. So with that, I think we're coming to the close of today's event. I would like again to thank all of the participants and all of those who have attended this session. Thanking you very much on behalf of IDLO and all of our partners, institutions who made this event possible today. Thank you again, and have a great continuation of CSW and a wonderful day ahead. Thank you and goodbye.